Number 1. Best friend. I had this friend when I was growing up that I was pretty close with. I'll call him Carl for the purpose of the story. I recall meeting him when we were in the first grade. I even swear I can remember the way that the schoolroom looked and such. Carl and I became fast friends, mostly because we were unlike most of the other boys in the school. Particularly, we liked playing with both boys' and girls' toys for some reason. It was hard to find boys or girls who were like this when I was younger, so it was just natural, it seemed, that he and I would be friends. Throughout the years growing up, Carl and I did just about everything together. He would always come to my birthday party as the first person to come and the last person to leave. My parents would give him a ride whenever we had one of our birthday parties at a Showbiz Pizza or a Chuck E. Cheese. I seem to remember having been to both of them at some point as a kid. We were a very close two-person friendship, and even when we played things like hide and seek with other kids, we still didn't connect with the other children the way we connected with each other. As we got around 13 years old, things began to change a little bit. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Boys go through puberty, and they begin liking girls more than they like each other. But that is not what I'm talking about. Yeah, we talked about girls and absolutely had an interest in girls, but there was much deeper and much stranger changes that Carl began going through. We both started watching horror television and horror movies when we were really young. Our parents wouldn't have been very happy about it if they had known, so we kept it pretty secret. Often we would spend the night at his house, in his bedroom, and wait for his parents to go to sleep. Since it was a sleepover, we were always allowed to stay up pretty late. Oh, and I don't want you to think that Carl's later behavior had anything to do with watching horror movies. I truly don't believe that horror movies, comics, TV shows, and things of that nature make people behave in a certain way. I needed to get that out there before I continued. The first thing that I noticed with Carl is that he would start playing little practical jokes on his siblings. Just some minor things, but he always got a big kick out of it when one of them would fall for one of his tricks. He seemed to get a real rush out of it or something, and then he started to up the ante, so to speak. Playing little innocent practical jokes on his family developed into playing jokes on his classmates as well. But it was never like a joke you play on someone, and afterward you all have a good laugh about it. Carl was not just into playing jokes, he was also into doing it and not getting caught. He never wanted anyone to know that it was indeed him who had played the joke. Here are just a few of the things that I remember him doing. In school, we used to have these desks that you would lift the lid of the desk up, and there was this compartment inside it. He'd gotten a garter snake, and he placed it in the desk of another student. He actually got to school very early, so he'd be the first one in the classroom, so he could leave before anyone knew. The student had opened his desk and began yelling, causing everyone else to panic. Carl would always react in the manner that the other students did. He did this to draw attention away from himself, and it worked. No one ever suspected him of anything, and he never got in trouble for anything. You name it, attacks on the teacher's chair, stealing her attendance book. He once rubbed the inside of every pair of his older brother's underwear with icy hot before letting them dry and putting them back in his drawer, and just a lot of things like that. I thought that it had reached its apex when it was in between classes once. In a crowded staircase, he tripped a kid who fell down the stairs and broke his arm. This was in high school, and the kid was a jock who pretty much lost his ability to play football after that. But it was when Carl was 16 that things took a turn that I would never have seen coming. We were still old enough to go trick-or-treating in my area. Personally, I had stopped going when I was 12. I just felt weird walking around begging for candy at that age. Carl had stopped too, but it wasn't unusual to see teenagers up to age 18 still going around asking for candy. But at age 16, Carl wanted to go trick-or-treating. He insisted that I get a costume and that I go with him. I really didn't want to. I mean, for one thing, I knew the guy. If he had suddenly wanted to do this again after 4 years, he had to have a reason for it, and that reason was most likely not a good one. Still, the guy was my friend, so I got myself a costume. He insisted that it was a costume in which no one would be able to tell who we were. I went as Freddy Krueger and bought myself a high-end rubber mask. Carl's costume was even more concealing. He actually wore boots with lifts in them to make himself look taller. He wore a Michael Myers-like outfit with some sort of welder's mask that covered his whole head. It was a weird costume, but it definitely hid who he was. I was wondering why Carl wanted to wear such an odd costume. When he told me why, I literally shivered. A chill went down my spine. Carl had heard about the case of the guy who had killed his son with the poisoned pixie sticks. I mean, back then, we all believed that people put things into candy, and it was always a smart thing to do, to check all the candy before eating it. But other than that one case, you never heard anything on the news about it. You never heard about candy with a razor blade in it, or anything like that. Carl wanted to change that. He had taken Tootsie Rolls and had inserted thin pins into them longwise. He then wrapped them back up. He was planning on putting them into a bucket and giving them out to kids while we were out trick-or-treating. I of course told Carl that was a crazy idea and some kid could get killed. His excuse was that no parent lets their children eat Halloween candy without checking it first. Not only was the wrapper twisted back on in a terrible fashion, the head of the pin was obviously sticking out of the end of the Tootsie Roll. I really didn't understand the point if he was making it obvious, and he simply said he wanted to scare the parents and kids into thinking somebody wanted to hurt them, but he was sure no one would actually get hurt. It was the most insane thing I'd ever heard a person tell me in my entire life. I mean, not only was the premise of his plan sickening beyond all measure, it wasn't foolproof either. All it took was one parent not checking one piece of candy, and that would make Carl a murderer. The two of us argued about it, and he was pretty angry at me for not wanting to go along with it. But it was only when I told him that if he did it, I would have to reveal him as the person who had done it, that he finally decided not to do it. He decided just to remain in and watch movies that night. Well, a lot of you may be wondering why I didn't just leave. Honestly, I felt that if I did, Carl would just go on with the plan on his own. I just couldn't take the chance that he would risk any child's life like that. Others may be wondering why I didn't call the police. Well, he backed off, and he wasn't going to do it. Even though he had done some amazingly bad things in recent years, I still believed him when he told me he wouldn't do it. The strangest thing is that Carl never seemed to have any resentment toward me about thwarting him. He continued to treat me exactly like he had treated me before this had happened. I had a hard time seeing him the same way, though, and although we continued to hang out until he graduated high school, I didn't keep in touch with him after he went away for college. I have absolutely no idea what had ever happened to him. I just hope he never did anything bad to anyone in real life like he had planned to do that night. Number 2. Graveyard. When I got too old for tricks or treats anymore, I began trying to find other ways to get scared. There were a bunch of different things I did on Halloween, but I think my favorite thing was the walk through the graveyard. It took a little bit of nerve to do it at the first time, and yes, it was very frightening the first time as well. I was scared to death by any little sound I heard, But of course, which is always the case, when it comes to scary things, the fear wore off when I realized there was no real danger. This was about 20 years ago. It was Halloween night, and I was 17 years old. I was talking with a friend on the phone. A friend who had agreed to accompany me and hang out in the graveyard that night. And don't get me wrong, we didn't just walk through there and that was it. We'd often find a nice and dark and quiet place to sit down, and we could talk for a while. But sometimes it was fun to also just walk up and down the paths the whole time. There would occasionally be other teenagers in the graveyard too, which often made it less scary. My friend's name was Josh, and we met up and walked down to the graveyard. The streets were already full of children in their costumes, trick-or-treating, and there were plenty of adults around, trying to scare them too. But we walked down the street, and then down a couple others, until we were moving off into the dark. I think one of the things I liked about the graveyard was the darkness of it all. When you first entered it at night, you couldn't see anything at all. And then, your eyes would slowly begin adjusting to the light. You would be able to see shadows and things like that. Pretty soon, you would be able to see the path better, and to see the tombstones better too. And although you would soon get used to the ambient lighting, you never got completely seeable. Things could still surprise you. Josh and I steered clear of a group of teenagers who were sitting around a monument and drinking. You will think I am lame for this, but I never even had my first drink until I was in my mid-20s. We just wanted to get around to the darker and scarier part of the graveyard. I am not sure how long we had been walking around before I first saw the scariest thing I'd ever seen in my life. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe something like the wind blowing the branches of a tree around or something. I wasn't sure. "Hey Josh," I whispered. "Did you see something over there?" Josh elbowed me. "Yeah, man, try that scare me on Halloween crap," he laughed. He then looked over to where I had been looking. Josh jumped, and I felt him grab me on my shoulder. "Damn, you're right," he suddenly whispered. "There was someone over there." We both kept looking in the direction, and we were both trying to be quiet as we watched this person. We weren't sure what it was about them, but it was just that we could barely make them out. It was like they were all dressed in black or something, and much more difficult to see than anything else had been. "Holy Josh said to me, with a hint of a laugh in his voice. "That's the frickin' Grim Reaper." We followed after the figure. After he'd given me a pretty good idea of what I was looking at, I was finally able to make out the form. Yeah, there was someone in the graveyard dressed as the Grim Reaper on Halloween night. "Hey, let's keep following him," Josh suggested. "Nah, I'm not interested," I protested. I was not really afraid of anything, but I really didn't feel like bugging anyone, especially someone who would dress up as a Grim Reaper and hang out in the graveyard on Halloween night. Anyway, Josh wasn't willing to sit around and wait for me. He kept following the person dressed as the Reaper. He found the whole thing amusing, I guess, and he wanted to see what was going on. The direction he was walking in was back towards the teenagers that we had seen hanging out, drinking. After a few moments, I followed after him. The closer I got to the area where the teenagers were, I heard some frantic cries, and when I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. The guy in the costume was nowhere to be found. Josh was standing there with a shocked look on his face, and one of the teenagers was giving CPR to another one. Now, I know what you were thinking. You think I believe that the Grim Reaper was real, and that one of the teenagers died. You know, for a second, I almost believed that. I mean, the whole thing was very, very creepy. But when my eyes adjusted again, I noticed the Reaper costume laying on the ground beside the boy getting the CPR. The teenagers had seen us pass by earlier and thought they would play a joke on us. One had been dressed up as the Reaper and was following us, trying to scare us. And then, when he got back to his circle of friends, he had some sort of attack. Whatever it was, and I don't know what it was, it didn't kill him though. Although Josh and I didn't really know the group, we did see the one dressed as the Reaper at school later that year. It's just one of those things that is really scary in the moment. The very idea of the existence of the Grim Reaper is silly, but with everything that happened that night, it just really seemed weird and freaky at the time. Josh had seen the guy take the costume off, but because I had only followed from behind, to me, it actually seemed like the Reaper had disappeared, and a kid was lying there dying. Number 3. The house. I had a pretty scary experience when I was a child, and I was out trick-or-treating. I was 11 years old at the time. My dad was enlisted in the Navy. We always lived on naval housing, usually in the poorer neighborhoods, but I actually remember most of that fondly. One of the reasons being that people seemed to decorate better for their holidays when they were poorer. Trick-or-treating was always done on Halloween at the time, none of this doing it on a weekend day because of the problem of being a school night. And we always began trick-or-treating around the time that the sun began to go down. I suppose that being on the naval base, it was automatically much safer than most other places. I was a thin, kind of nerdy guy, but I also tended to get bullied a little bit in school. But I did have my own friends, and we all decided to go out together. We didn't go with our parents. They stayed home to give out candy. Like I mentioned, because it was a Navy base, we all felt rather safe with the situation. So this was the way we went about it. Of course, being a nerdy guy, all my friends were too. We had the same bullies bullying us in school, but we also knew where those guys lived, and did our best to avoid them as much as possible. On this Halloween, we had been out for over an hour or so, walking all around the neighborhood. I never see people trick-or-treating like that anymore nowadays, not with the sheer and vast number of children out after dark, and we were getting to a part of the neighborhood that we weren't familiar with. After a bit, we slipped out of the Navy base housing and were on a regular neighborhood street. We weren't supposed to do that, but we were on a quest for more candy. We came up upon this area where there were not as many kids as the other places, and when we did, we noticed that there was a group of kids, maybe a year or two older than us, hanging out in the front lawn of this house. We tried to avoid them, especially when we recognized them as kids from school. And they weren't bullies or anything like that, but we knew who they were, and we really didn't want to have much to do with them. One of the boys recognized me and yelled out to me to come over there. I hesitated. I really didn't want to be anywhere near them. However, they kept calling, and we realized it might be better to go over and see what they want rather than ignore them. They weren't bullies, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't become bullies if they were angry at us for ignoring them. We walked up to them and asked them what was going on. They told us that the house they were looking at was haunted by a demon because a guy who used to live there was possessed and murdered his family, and they dared me to go up and see it. I wanted nothing to do with it and told the boys I didn't want to. I was prepared to walk away with my friends. However, before I could, one of the boys grabbed me. He began pushing me up to the door of the house. I was terrified and began screaming for help, but the group of older kids intimidated my friends from helping me, and he was pushing me up towards the house as quickly as he could. He was telling me things like the demon was going to drag me into hell with him, and things like that, and then suddenly, he let go of me. Since I was pressed back against him, I fell backwards, but when I got up and looked around, all of the boys, both my friends and his friends, were running off. I turned and looked at the house, and saw someone standing in the door frame. My first impulse was that it was the demon, and I needed to get up and run. "Damn kids, stop fucking around on my lawn," I heard the old man in the doorway say. "I don't have candy. That's why I keep the damn lights out." I got up and ran off. I wasn't scared of the possible demon or anything, but I was scared off of a pissed off senior citizen. I told my friends about the old man and the misunderstanding, but we never told any of the older kids. Let them think it was a demon for what they did to me. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I know it is a bit early for a Halloween video, but I thought I would get one out in the beginning of the month. I do have a little bit of sad news. Our channel mascot, Ichigo, the original Killer Orange Cat, is in the vet right now. He's not been able to pee all day, and we had a similar problem like this about 8 years ago. My sister designed this new t-shirt, which is linked to in the description. It's a Halloween-themed Ichigo shirt. She made it and wanted me to pass it on with the knowledge that any profit made from the sale of the shirt will go to pay for Ichigo's vet bills. We didn't want to start a donation service because we think it's better that people who contribute should get something out of it too. We'll keep you updated on Ichigo and let you know how he's doing in the community tab on the channel. In the meantime, please don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.